All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome along. This evening, we're going to be looking at the case for the resurrection of Jesus, and this will build upon the material that we have been discussing in previous sessions. So if you need to catch up, then also I advise to go and watch the previous sessions, previous 14 weeks, where we've reviewed various lines of evidence for the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts, and indeed their grounding in eyewitness testimony. And that provides the framework and foundation for the evidence that we're going to begin to look at this evening, starting with the case for the resurrection. So let's turn to the world's most biggest authority on biblical studies, Richard Dawkins, or not. He says in The God Delusion, published in 2006, when pressed, many educated Christians today are too loyal to deny the virgin birth and the resurrection, but it embarrasses them because their rational minds know it is absurd, so they would much rather not be asked. Well, I'm going to seek to challenge this perspective on the resurrection over the course of the presentation this evening, and we will seek to use various lines of evidence, I think, very securely establish the resurrection as being the best explanation and the most probable explanation of the pertinent historical data. So how do we reason about the issue and when we're investigating a purported historical event? What is the best way to go about evaluating the pertinent evidence? Well, first of all, we have to investigate the facts. Which facts have to be explained? And then we want to go about investigating and evaluating counterclaims to find out what best explains those facts. So many of you might be familiar with the minimal facts approach that was developed by Gary Habermas and also by Michael Licona. He often calls it the historical bedrock approach. And the minimal facts approach basically argues, or basically limits the data set that is brought to bear in making the case for the resurrection to those facts which fulfill two criteria, namely that they must not only be supported by the historical evidence in Habermas's judgment, but they also must have a very high majority in terms of scholarly affirmation from across the theological spectrum. So according to Gary Habermas, it has to have at least a 90% majority of scholars who acknowledge a particular fact, not just Christian scholars, but also more liberal and skeptical scholars as well. So it must have scholars, including skeptics, across the current ideological spectrum who agree with that fact. And this is part of the methodology and is treated as having epistemic significance. So a few of the criteria, or a few of the facts that satisfy the criteria would be that Jesus died due to the process of crucifixion, and that very soon afterward, Jesus' disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the resurrected Jesus, and that just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus also experienced what he thought was a post-resurrection appearance of the risen Jesus. Now, there's a number of problems with the minimal facts approach. Those of you who are familiar with my work will know some of those problems. But one central problem with the minimal facts case is when it comes to establishing what the appearances of the resurrected Jesus were purportedly like. Because if you can't say with confidence what the experiences that brought the apostles to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead were like, it becomes very difficult to evaluate and adjudicate the rationality of the disciples' belief that the resurrection is the best interpretation of what they saw. So some limitations that are placed on the appearance fact is that it does not mean that the appearances were like those described in detail in the gospel accounts, right? Not enough scholars across the ideological spectrum acknowledge that. And it does not by itself mean that the disciples believed this was physically alive and appeared bodily. So Habermas and Cohn expressly treat that as a different second order fact. So some scenarios that are consistent with the appearance fact would include floating, non-speaking Jesus, or a Jesus who appears only briefly and speaks only a few words and disappears again. Or and these scenarios are weak, or in the first case, even disconfirmatory of bodily resurrection, right? So this is a point that's often overlooked in discussions of the minimal facts case for the resurrection, that the appearances aren't necessarily even evidence for the resurrection. They could even, in principle, be taken as disconfirmatory evidence of the bodily resurrection. If you imagine a floating Jesus who hovers above the ground, and you move your hand towards him to feel the spear wound in his side, for example, and your hand passes right through him, well, that would be disconfirmatory of a bodily resurrection. So this is the point that often gets overlooked. Moreover, when a skeptic pushes back against the minimal facts, say the appearance fact, with the hypothesis of some sort of objective vision or mass hallucinatory experience, Habermas and Lacuna often push back on that by pointing out the implausibility of shared or group hallucination experiences. But that is to switch the criteria midway through the argument, because there isn't the widespread consensus of scholars that would acknowledge the group experiences, and much less that the appearances were anything like those described in the Gospels and Acts. And so there's a bit of a bait and switch that takes place where the criteria are changed midway through the argument without disclosing that to the audience. So that's problematic as far as I'm concerned. So if we're not able to say in detail what the experiences were like, it's very difficult to evaluate whether the disciples were rational in coming to the conclusion that Jesus was raised from the dead as the best interpretation of what they experienced, even if we include the second order fact that they believed that Jesus was raised bodily. Indeed, Habermas's method doesn't seem to even quantify or account for the level of confidence that the scholars he is citing have in the so-called minimal facts. For example, whether the scholar uses qualified language like it may have occurred or that it's plausibly true. Habermas doesn't even quantify separately an acknowledgement of group appearances from an acknowledgement of individual appearances. And this is a very serious issue, since many people who present the minimal facts case assume that the statement that a majority of scholars acknowledge appearances means that they grant group appearances. And then they'll say, there are no such things as group hallucinations, etc. Another problem, by the way, is that often one of the minimal facts is brought up is the conversion of Jesus' half-brother James as a result of his of the post-mortem appearance of Jesus to James. But it's important to distinguish between the appearance to James, which doesn't enjoy that, or experience, which enjoy that scholarly consensus, versus the conversion of James in consequence of that experience, which does not enjoy the same level of scholarly majority. So it's very important to be very clear as to which of the facts are in fact affirmed by the consensus of contemporary New Testament scholars. Not even all conservative scholars would affirm that James was a skeptic during Jesus' lifetime, for example. Richard Bauckham, for instance, would reject that. So we have to be very careful. So what's the alternative that I would suggest or propose that we employ in place of a minimal facts approach? So Lydia McGrew coined this term the maximal data approach, and this is an approach to the resurrection that's inspired from the famous Christian philosopher William Paley in his book, A View of the Evidence of Christianity. And so some distinctives of the maximal data approach is that it asserts up front that the Gospels' resurrection accounts represent what the disciples claimed happened to them. And this can be supported by arguments for the reliability and origin of the Gospels and eyewitness testimony, much like we've discussed over the previous 14 weeks. Notice that the argument is not, or does not assume, the detailed facticity of the resurrection accounts. Of course, that would be circular, right? If the gospel accounts concerning the resurrection are factually accurate, well, of course Jesus rose from the dead. So we're not saying the resurrection accounts in the gospels are factually accurate, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. Rather, we're saying that the statements in the gospels and Acts concerning the resurrection reflects the unembellished testimony of those who are purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And so that is a set of claims that we have to give an account of or explain. So the maximal data approach treats the objective vision theory as not being a claim that the resurrection occurred, and asserts up front that the early chapters of Acts accurately represent what the disciples were testifying, how soon, and under what dangerous conditions. And of course, these are battles that we're prepared to fight, and we are prepared to justify those assertions. So let's then evaluate the counterclaims that could purport to give an account of why the apostles made the sorts of claims that they did about what they experienced. So after Jesus died and was buried, we have four rival hypotheses. Number one, his immediate followers did not claim he rose again. They would have been as surprised as anyone else to hear that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And so the Gospels, in other words, are later myths. And so we can call that the myth hypothesis. Or perhaps his followers were deceived and thinking he rose again. And we can call it the hallucination hypothesis. Or his followers deceived others into thinking that he rose again. We can call that the conspiracy hypothesis. Or finally, Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. And we can call that the resurrection hypothesis. And I would argue that these broad explanatory categories are mutually exhaustive, that there are no other options, although they could be correct in combination with one another. Okay, so here's a summary of the argument that I'm going to be putting forward in this presentation. And as I said, this is inspired from William Paley, a famous Christian philosopher, in his book, A View of the Evidence of Christianity, which I highly recommend for your reading. So first of all, we would argue that we possess testimony from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus rose physically from the dead and appeared to them alive. Moreover, the content of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceived. The circumstances of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceivers. And therefore, the most probable explanation is that the content of their testimony is true. So let's examine each of those contentions in turn. Let's start with the first one. We possess testimony from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus rose physically from the dead and appeared to them alive. One line of evidence that the apostles affirmed the resurrection, this isn't a later development that came much later, is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. And for reasons I won't get into in this presentation, though I have an essay on it on my website, for those that are interested, most scholars, and I think with good reason, take the text in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7 as being a pre-Pauline creedal tradition, which most probably goes back to the apostles, and Paul received that creedal tradition from the Jerusalem apostles, because the way that he opens, the language that he employs, for I deliver to you as of first importance why I also received. And it has this very rhythmic structure that's designed for ease of memorization, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, independent of whether this text, in fact, represents a creed, and I think it probably does, although I don't think it's a completely secure conclusion. Independent of that, though, we can still argue, I think, robustly, that this claim, in fact, goes back to the apostles, from what Paul goes on to say next. So continuing on from verses 9-11, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached and so you believed. Now pay attention to verse 11. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached and so you believed. In other words, Paul is assuming that the Corinthian Christians understand his statements concerning the gospel, the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, and the appearances to the 12 and others. It is consistent with what's already been preached to them by the other apostles, in particular Peter and James and so forth. We also know independently that the Corinthians were acquainted with the preaching of at least Peter, because in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul chides the Corinthians for having divisions and factions in their midst. Some say, I follow Cephas, others, I follow Apollos, others, I follow Paul, and the super spiritual one said, I follow Christ. And so the Corinthians were acquainted with the preaching of Peter. And so it seems likely that Paul's statement concerning the resurrection, which is the key theme in these verses 3-8, is consistent with what's already been proclaimed to the Corinthians by Peter, with whose preaching they are already acquainted and familiar. So that indicates that the claim of the resurrection goes back to the apostles. Of course, we have to examine the Gospels and Acts to get a handle on the nature of the claimed experiences. I would also bring up at this point the principle of restraint. I've touched on this a little bit before, but none of the Gospels give any details about the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus to Peter or the appearance of Jesus' brother James, although both of those are mentioned in the statement in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 that we just read. And then when I talk about the appearance to Peter here, I'm talking specifically about the individual appearance to Peter, not the appearance when Peter is part of a group, like in John 21. So there's a brief mention of the appearance to Peter in Luke 24, 33-34. So it's not that Luke is just unaware of such an appearance. He is aware of it. And he shows this in Luke 24, where the Emmaus disciples find the 11 and those who are with them gathered together saying, "The Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." And the appearance to Peter, as I said, is also alluded to in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5. The appearance to James, which is also mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15:7, is not mentioned in the Gospels or Acts at all. And so it's striking that it's specifically the individual appearances that are mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 with no further elaboration or detail, but are not mentioned at all in the Gospels and Acts, even though Luke is aware of such an individual encounter that Peter had with the risen Jesus. Now, presumably Peter and James both made it known that they had seen the Lord after the resurrection, but for whatever reason, neither of them made an account of the private meeting available for publication. So Lydia McGrew, in her book, Hidden in Plain View, summarizes, she says, if the gospel writers were trying truthfully to record only what they either knew directly or had reliable sources to tell them about, they would have very little to say about such meetings, exactly as we find. But if they felt free to invent dialogue and scenes in order to fill in where information was otherwise missing, why would they not have done so here? Their restraint points to the conclusion that they are truthful, reliable recorders. So what other evidence can we bring to bear besides 1 Corinthians 15? 1 Corinthians 15 is useful in showing that the apostles first proclaimed the resurrection. This isn't something that arose much later, but 1 Corinthians 15 alone cannot establish the nature of those claimed experiences. And for that, we have to turn to the Gospels and Acts. And so let's turn to Acts, where we read in chapter 2, Peter's statement at Pentecost, "Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we all are witnesses." Now, you might, so this indicates that Peter and the other apostles have had encounters with the risen Jesus following his death. And of course, if you look at the Gospel of Luke, which is composed by the same author, in chapter 24, we learn about the appearance of Jesus to the Emmaus disciples, Cleopas and his companion, as well as to the 11. And we read in Luke 24 about Jesus having an extended conversation with the Emmaus disciples, doing Bible study with them, eating fish, broiled fish in front of the disciples there. And so Luke Acts has quite a bit to say about the detailed nature of the purported experiences with the risen Jesus. Now, you might wonder, though, can we trust Luke Acts to give us an accurate account of what the apostles were saying, of what the contention was? Well, let's employ two tests to establish that we can indeed trust Luke Acts to give us an accurate account of what the apostles were claiming concerning the nature of the purported experiences with the risen Jesus. First of all, Luke Acts says it is grounded in eyewitness testimony with Jerusalem witnesses. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And secondly, the author reliably worked with Paul, and so he was, in fact, present at the Jerusalem church and was in a position to know what was being asserted by those who were purportedly eyewitnesses of the resurrection. So let's start with the first one, that Luke Acts says it is grounded in eyewitness testimony. So in the prologue of Luke, in first 4 verses, we read, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you've been taught. And so Luke claims to have received information concerning Jesus' ministry from people who were originally eyewitnesses, even though Luke himself was not an eyewitness. And it's not quite clear exactly in what sense he's received information. Has he interviewed them, or is he just drawing upon written reports or perhaps oral testimony? Luke, the prologue of Luke doesn't make that clear. But we can also show, if we go over to the book of Acts, written by the same author, in chapter 21, Luke has access to people who are in fact eyewitnesses. He has direct access to people who were eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. So in Luke 21, 17 through 18, it says, when we, notice the inclusive plural pronoun, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. And so Luke is present with Paul in Acts 21, when Paul meets with the Jerusalem leaders, including James, the Lord's brother, who happens to be the leader of the Jerusalem church. And we've shown in previous sessions that the author of Luke Acts was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. I take that to be very well established. And so that supports that Luke was in fact here present with Paul in Jerusalem, where he met with the Jerusalem leadership, including James, the leader of the Jerusalem church. So let's then turn to the second test. The author reliably worked with Paul, and so he was, as he claims, present at the Jerusalem church. Well, what lines of evidence might we draw upon to establish this conclusion? Well, first of all, Luke had Pauline knowledge of Paul's activities. I've discussed this in previous sessions where we reviewed undesigned coincidences between the book of Acts and the letters of Paul, so I won't belabor that further here. Secondly, Luke has Pauline knowledge of the world, that is, knowledge of the world that's best explained by Luke being a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. We've looked at various instances in the book of Acts of extra-biblical confirmation. Colin Hemer documents 84 such examples in his book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. And in a world where people couldn't just readily go to Google or Wikipedia or consult a reference work at the local library, that is, I think, quite good evidence that this author is someone who is most plausibly a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, has actually been to those places himself. And that's consistent with the use of the plural pronoun and consistent with the knowledge that Luke has of Paul's activities, as established by the numerous examples of undesigned coincidences, the scores of examples of those between Acts and the letters of Paul. And finally, Luke traveled with Paul to Rome. And we've looked in previous session at the evidence bearing on the shipwreck of Paul in Acts 27, and that's among the wee passages. And so if Luke was present with Paul during that voyage, which it seems likely he was, then that supports that Luke was indeed present with Paul at the Jerusalem church in Acts 21. Of course, Luke was with Paul subsequent to that visit to Jerusalem in Caesarea Maritima, where Paul was imprisoned for at least 2 years, and Caesarea Maritima is fairly close to Jerusalem, and so he would have had access to that treasure trove of living witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, and would have been in a position to know what the eyewitnesses were saying concerning Jesus. And so given that, combined with the fact that Luke says that he's received material in some sense from eyewitnesses, it seems quite likely that Luke is, and given also Luke's demonstrated meticulousness as an historian and his care for detail, it seems very likely that Luke is reporting what he understands to be the claims of the original eyewitnesses concerning Jesus' resurrection. So besides Luke Acts, we also have the Gospel of John, and we talked last week about the evidence for John being written by an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry and a disciple. And we've looked at various other lines of evidence for that conclusion in previous weeks as well, various extra-biblical confirmations, undesigned coincidences. For a detailed discussion of that subject, I recommend Lydia McGrew's book, The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. So in John's account, in chapter 20, verses 19 to 23, he gives an account of a description of the appearance to the 11. On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you withhold forgiveness from any, it is withheld." And that's just one episode in John. You also have the appearance of Thomas, who wasn't present at the first meeting. You also have the appearance to the 7 disciples. Jesus cooks breakfast for them in John 21 on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And so it's a sort of testimonial claim, again, just like in Luke, that's quite difficult to be honestly mistaken about. And so the question is, does this really go back to the eyewitnesses? And as I've shown in previous sessions, John, the author of John's Gospel, whom I take to be John the son of Zebedee, was an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry. And thus, this is a statement of an eyewitness concerning the appearance to the 11 disciples. John himself claims to be an eyewitness, as we talked about last week. So in 1 John 1-4, John says that which was from the beginning. And everyone, by the way, or most scholars would agree that whoever wrote the fourth gospel also wrote 1 John. There's very compelling reason for that when you look at the similarities between John's gospel and the epistle of 1 John. But he says that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and testified to it, and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father, and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with the Son, Jesus Christ. And we're writing these things so that our joy may be complete. And so you see the distinction that he draws between us and you. So he's not just talking about generic humanity that's seen with their eyes and touched with their hands and so forth. Rather, he draws this distinction, saying the life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which is with the Father, must be manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you. And so he seems here to be claiming to be an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry, and by extension, combining that with John's gospel, composed by the same author, of Jesus' resurrection. He also claims to be an eyewitness in John 21-24. As we mentioned last week, this is a disciple who's bearing witness about these things, and it was written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And I mentioned that although some scholars will argue that actually this is denying being a beloved disciple because he seems to distinguish himself, or the community that's composing the gospel seems to distinguish themselves from the beloved disciple, I think this is best understood as being similar to what you see in Romans 16:23 with Paul's scribe Tertius interjecting and inserting his greetings. I am Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. And it's also, this statement is consistent with what we see in 1 John 1, and is also consistent with the internal evidence indicating that the author is in fact the beloved disciple, an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, and indeed John the son of Zebedee. So having established this first premise, that we possess testimony from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus was physically in the dead, appeared to them alive, let's now turn to the second major contention, namely that the content of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceived. Now, if you talk to a skeptic, you might often hear that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, particularly on details. And eyewitness testimony is often not considered reliable in a court of law. And this is true. And indeed, studies have shown that under certain conditions, I'm happy to send peer-reviewed academic literature on the subject if anyone's interested, but studies have shown that under certain conditions, eyewitness testimony is typically unreliable, especially on details. So, for example, if the events happen quickly, over a period of seconds or minutes, or if the participants are strangers to one another, or if there's a weapon present, such as a knife or a gun. If you want to stay alive a bit longer, your attention focuses on the weapon, and so you often miss particulars of the situation. But the resurrection appearances, by contrast, are public. Jesus appears to multiple people at once. They are multi-sensory. So we're not just talking about individual sightings at a great distance and very briefly, but rather we're talking about, so they involve not just sight, but hearing, conversation, including group conversations, physical contact, etc. extended discourses like they made disciples, even Jesus cooking breakfast for them in the shore of the Sea of Galilee in John 21, and they are extended across time. So it's not just a brief and confusing episode. According to Acts 1, the resurrection appearances after Jesus' death were extended across a 40-day time period. We can also consider the diversity of the appearances, so in different circumstances. So Mary Magdalene sees Jesus alone. The other group of women, including Salome, Joanna, the other Mary, etc., saw Jesus when they were together, but separately from Mary. And also the different circumstances. So Mary Magdalene when she's weeping at the tomb, and the other women while they're running away with fear and joy, etc. Thomas was not with the disciples on the first appearance, and later Thomas was with them. And then you've got the appearance to a specific group of 7 in John 21, and Cleopas and his companion on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. So the group of 7 are not in the upper room, they're in Galilee. But it's not the time in Galilee that Matthew tells us about, and then Jesus eats breakfast with them, and he cooks breakfast with them on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And then Jesus also, of course, eats with the disciples on another occasion as well in Luke 24, when he asks for fish, and they give him a piece of broiled fish, and he eats it in their presence. There are also some curious features of the resurrection narratives. So the resurrection narratives are independent, unlike most of the synoptic gospels, where you've got a relationship where Matthew and Luke seem to be drawing upon Mark and using Mark as a source material. The passion and resurrection narrative, they seem to be largely independent of one another. There's also an apparent lack of theological reflection. So, for example, the Gospels, in particular Matthew, love to say this was done so that Scripture might be fulfilled, and then they quote the Scripture. But you don't see any of that with the resurrection narratives. They seem to be lacking in that sort of theological reflection. In fact, one of the most important texts in Second Temple Judaism concerning the resurrection was Daniel 12, which describes the righteous of Israel at the time of the general resurrection, shining like stars. But no one ever portrays Jesus as shining like a star in that way. And so that's striking as well. Given that Jesus is supposed to be the first fruits of the general resurrection, the first to be raised to glory and immortality. John's gospel also, interestingly, has Jesus walking through closed doors. Now, John's gospel, and indeed his epistles, are written in part as a polemic against docetic Gnosticism, which was becoming prominent at the time of his writing, which is basically a Gnostic view which maintained that Jesus didn't have a physical body. So the Gnostics didn't have so much a problem with the deity of Christ as they did the humanity of Christ. And so John is very emphatic about the physicality of the incarnation. In John 1:14, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. He also writes in his epistles that if anyone comes claiming that the Christ has not come in the flesh, is of the Antichrist. He's emphatic about, so Thomas is invited to touch Jesus, and he puts his fingers into the prints of the nails in his hands and the spear wound in his side. Well, what's interesting, and N.T. Wright brings this point up in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, that this same John has Jesus appearing and disappearing at will, entering and leaving through closed doors. That's not the sort of thing that you might expect John to invent if he's writing his gospel in part as a polemic against ascetic Gnosticism. That's counterproductive for his case that he's trying to make. And so that's not the sort of thing that you might expect John to invent if he's just making stuff up. And so that also, I think, is of evidential value in confirming the verisimilitude of the accounts concerning the resurrection. There's also an example of an undesigned coincidence involving a resurrection narrative. So in John 21:15, this is when Jesus meets the 7 disciples and has breakfast with them. And it says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, this raises an interesting question. Why does Jesus ask Peter whether he loves him more than the others do? Seems like a pretty rude question to ask. Well, the explanation is not supplied for us in John's gospel. But if we go over to Matthew 26, verse 33, we read that Peter answered him, "Though they all fall away, because of me, I will never away." So Matthew quotes, though John does not, Peter's boast that he was the most faithful of Jesus' disciples. And so then that illuminates Jesus' question to Peter in John 21, "Peter, do you truly love me more than these?" So that's an example of unexplained coincidence that involves a post-resurrection account. Another interesting feature is the account concerning Cleopas and his companion in Luke 24. We read that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation that you were holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these days?" Now, this is an interesting question. Why is only Cleopas named here? So the account here of the Emmaus disciples concerns Cleopas and his unnamed companion. Now, if you're making stuff up, why do you only name one of the disciples on the road to Emmaus and not the other? It seems likely that Cleopas was the eyewitness source behind this story that Luke was interviewing, and he simply either doesn't know or for whatever reason doesn't choose to mention the name of the other companion of Cleopas. And so that I think also is a mark of verisimilitude. As to why Cleopas and his companion failed to recognize Jesus despite being disciples of him, I would argue that they were probably more distant disciples, so they're not part of Jesus' close inner circle, but rather these are distant disciples who followed him at some distance, not one of Jesus' immediate disciples. And especially when you see someone out of context, you often at first don't recognize them. And of course, Jesus had just been crucified, and so they shouldn't necessarily be expecting to run into Jesus. And so I don't think that the fact that they don't immediately recognize him is particularly problematic. Now, let's consider a thought experiment. What if we had lost all of the Gospels and had only fragments of the remainder of the New Testament? Charles Leslie put forward a number of criteria by which we can assess claims concerning the past. And I summarize these with the acronym PAST, which I credit Timothy McGrew for. And the acronyms, so P stands for public, A stands for act or monument to commemorate the event. S means it stands for an object of the senses, and T is for time at which the act or monument was instituted, should be back in the era when the fact is supposed to have taken place. Now, obviously, the resurrection experiences are public. They involve not just one individual at a time, but group, shared experiences. Now, it's obviously an object of the senses. But what about an act or monument to commemorate the event? Well, an obvious act or monument that was instituted to commemorate the event would be the Lord's Supper, that was commemorated on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, the day in which Jesus allegedly rose from the dead. But what about the time at which the act or monument was instituted? How long after the event was that act instituted? Well, so how early was the Lord's Day observance instituted? So let's have a look at some of the early church fathers. Origen, living the late 2nd, early 3rd century, said, "On Sunday, none of the actions of the world should be done. If then you abstain from all the works of this world and keep yourselves free for spiritual things, go to church, listen to the readings and divine homilies, meditate on heavenly things." So Sunday was the sacred day for early Christians, according to Origen. Tertullian likewise says, in the same way, if we devote Sunday to rejoicing from a far different reason than sun worship, we have some resemblance to those who devote the day of Saturn to ease and luxury, though they too go far away from Jewish ways, of which indeed they are ignorant. Justin Martyr, writing in the middle of the 2nd century, says, "And on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together in one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. Then when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. But Sunday is the day on which we hold our common assembly, because it is the first day in which God, having wrought a change in the darkness and matter, made the world, and Jesus Christ our Savior on the same day rose from the dead." So that was the middle of the 2nd century. The Epistle of Barnabas, which is quite early, dating anywhere between about 70 and 132 AD, says, "And we too rejoice in celebrating the 8th day because that was when Jesus rose from the dead and showed himself again and ascended into heaven. Ignatius of Antioch, writing in the very early 2nd century on his way to his martyrdom in Rome, he wrote to various churches to say his final farewells. And in the epistle to the Magnesians, he says, "We have seen how former adherents to the ancient customs have since attained to a new hope, so that they have given up keeping the Sabbath and now order their lives by the Lord's day instead, the day when life was done for us, thanks to him and his death. That death, though some deny it, is the very mystery which has moved us to become believers and endure tribulation, to prove ourselves pupils of Jesus Christ, our sole teacher." Here's a text from the Didache, which is a late 1st century church manual, which says, "But every Lord's day, gather yourselves together and break bread and give thanksgiving after having confessed your transgressions, that your sacrifice may be pure." So there's a lot of references in the early church, and consistently there's no deviation from this tradition, that the sacred day for Christians is not the Sabbath day, the Saturday, but rather the first day of the week, which early Christians called the Lord's Day. Now, there are also New Testament references to this as well. So Revelation 1:10, John says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day," and he doesn't take any time out to explain to his readers what the Lord's Day is, because it's assumed that everyone knows, because it was a widely established practice at the time of his writing. 1 Corinthians 16:2, this is now early 50s AD, "On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come." So there's no explanation as to why the first day of the week, because by the time Paul's writing to the Corinthians in the early 50s AD, it's widely established Christians assemble on the first day of the week. Acts 20, verse 7, "On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread," again, it's just taken for granted, Christians met on the first day of the week. Now, the Christian community in Acts practices the breaking of bread as a memorial of the death of Christ, and that's also discussed in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And this isn't merely consistent with Jesus' reported command in Luke 22, but it's incomprehensible unless the shame of that death were somehow transformed. Now, what's interesting is that, so in 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 23, Paul says, "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep." Now, what does he mean by that expression, first fruits of those who have fallen asleep? Well, he's thinking back to the first fruits feast that is instituted in the book of Leviticus, chapter 23. And the first fruits feast would be the celebration of the first fruits of the harvest. That was the guarantor, if you will, of the remaining harvest that was to be gathered. And so Christ then is the fulfillment of the first fruits feast, because he is the first to be raised to glory and immortality, serving as the guarantor of the general resurrection to come. So in Leviticus 23, we read, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, so that you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it.'" And so the first fruits feast, according to Leviticus, is to be celebrated the day following the first Sabbath, following the Passover, which would make it the Sunday. Now, there was a deviation between the Sadducees and the Pharisees as to whether the Sabbath in question here is the weekly Sabbath, which was the Sadducees' view, or it was the Feast of Passover itself, which would be the Pharisees' view. In the first century, the time when Jesus lived and Paul wrote, the Sadducees were in charge of the temple cult, and so their view was the one that prevailed. So the first fruits feast was celebrated on the day following the first Sabbath, following the Passover, making it the Sunday. And so that's the day in which Jesus rose from the dead. And that again is points away from the hypothesis of the disciples being honestly mistaken, because that points to design. And then the question is, okay, what's the locus of the design? Is it that God raised Jesus from the dead on that special day to fulfill the imagery of the first fruits feast, or did the evangelists have Jesus rise from the dead on that day? But in any case, the belief in Jesus' resurrection on the first day of the week, which was, by the way, recorded in all four Gospels, it was the first day of the week, it seems to be a very early and primitive belief. Not only is it found in all four Gospels, but you find this widespread changing of the sacred day from the Sabbath, the Saturday, to the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, on account of the fact that Jesus rose from the dead on that day. There is no deviation from this in the early church and in the first century literature that we have in the New Testament in particular, as well as the Didache and other early sources, Ignatius. That's striking. I think that also mitigates or argues against the hypothesis that the apostles were honestly mistaken in their statements concerning the resurrection. So thirdly, then, the circumstances of the apostolic testimony makes it enormously improbable that they were deceivers. So what do the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? Why would they die for a known lie? Many people will die for something that they believe to be true, but very few will die for something that they know to be false. Now, the martyrdom of Peter, Paul, and James, the son of Zebedee, and James, the Lord's brother, are particularly well attested. In the case of Peter, we have First Clement. We also who wrote the end of the first century. Most scholars date him to around AD 96 when he wrote his letter to the Corinthian Christians. You also have John 21, where Jesus predicts Peter's death, anticipates it, and it seems unlikely that Peter would have attributed that statement to Jesus had Peter not died in the way that Jesus described. And so we have early attestation for Peter's martyrdom. Paul also, First Clement mentions his martyrdom. We also have abundant testimony to his willingness to suffer persecution in his own letters in multiple places, as well as Acts as well, and First Clement, of course. James, the son of Zebedee, we have attestation that he was beheaded by Herod Agrippa in Acts 12. And James, the Lord's brother, his martyrdom is attested in Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews. The other apostles, we don't know a lot about how they were martyred or whether they were martyred, but we do know that what we can say with tremendous confidence is that there was a general context of persecution, whereby the original witnesses and those who were proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus and preaching Christianity and so forth, voluntarily underwent and endured sufferings and labors and hardships and persecutions and imprisonments, dangers on account of their testimony that Christ was raised from the dead. And that goes a long way towards establishing that they were at least sincere in that proclamation. And so William Paley, in his book, A View of the Evidence of Christianity, summarizes thusly. He says, "There is satisfactory evidence that many, professing to be original witnesses of the Christian miracles, passed their lives in labors, dangers, and sufferings, voluntarily undergone in attestation of the accounts which they delivered, and solely in consequence of their belief of those accounts, and that they also submitted from the same motives to new rules of conduct." Moreover, you have the disciples' very abrupt change of heart. For example, given Peter's behavior on Thursday evening, his threefold denial of Jesus, why would he suddenly change his mind by Saturday night and decide to start an elaborate hoax that would involve lifelong continued association with Jesus' name based on a deliberate conspiracy? And of course, the same could be said of the other disciples who all forsook Jesus and fled in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, Peter does appear to have felt guilty about his threefold denial of Jesus, but that it doesn't seem to me that would motivate him to within just a few days turn around and start perpetuating this hoax that Jesus was raised from the dead. If anything, that feeling that he had let Jesus down, that he had failed him, and his bitter weeping concerning that failure would be likely to move him to be a better person, not start this sinister and elaborate hoax. Furthermore, there is the issue of Jewish beliefs concerning resurrection in the ancient world, and indeed the Greco-Roman beliefs concerning resurrection. So this is derivative from research by British scholar N.T. Wright in his book The Resurrection of the Son of God, where he surveys various perspectives on the resurrection in the ancient world, and he notes that in the Greco-Roman world, the physical world is seen as being defiling and corrupt, while the spirit or soul was considered good. And so no one that was released from that world of material flesh would ever want it back. And so the resurrection for the Greco-Roman world was not only not possible, but it was also undesirable. Whereas in Judaism, you have two major sects. You have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection or spirits or angels or demons and so forth. Whereas the Pharisees do believe in the resurrection, but only a general resurrection at the end of the world per Daniel 12, not this first fruits resurrection in the middle of history, where you have the resurrection of one man to glory and immortality ahead of the general resurrection. That was foreign to the ancient Jewish perspective, so far as we can tell. At least it was foreign to the mainstream Jewish perspectives of the time. Now, when you turn to the pagan literature, or literature concerning pagan beliefs about resurrection. So Theophilus of Antioch was a Christian in the 2nd century, and he wrote a letter, an apology to Autolycus, who was a pagan. And he says, then as to your denying that the dead are not raised, for you say, show me even one who has been raised from the dead, that seeing I may believe. And so we often think that we in the 21st century are the enlightened ones, that we are skeptical of miracles and resurrections and things. And back then in the ancient world, people were very credulous and everyone knew someone that was raised from the dead or something like that. Whereas the ancients were very skeptical of the resurrection, perhaps for different reasons than we are today, but nonetheless, they were very skeptical. And this is an example of a text that demonstrates that. Fronto, the teacher of Marcus Aurelius, also says, this is 2nd century, and I quote, yet I should be glad to be informed whether or not you rise again with bodies, and if so, with what bodies, whether with the same or with renewed bodies. Without a body, then as far as I know, there will be neither be mind nor soul nor life. With the same body, but this has already been previously destroyed. With another body, then it is a new person who is born, not the former one restored. And yet so long a time has passed away, innumerable ages have flowed by, and what single individual has returned from the dead, either by the fate of Protesilos, with permission to sojourn even for a few hours, or that we might believe it for an example. All such figments are of an unhealthy belief and vain sources of comfort. And finally, here's another quote from ancient literature. This is from Eumenides, and I quote, but once a mortal's blood has rained into the dust, the man is dead, and then there's no return. So as I said, both Jews and pagans were very skeptical of this sort of resurrection claim. Another argument against the conspiracy hypothesis is the role of women as the chief discoverers of the empty tomb, according to all 4 Gospels. So in all 4 Gospels, the first people at the tomb are women. And this is significant because in the patriarchal society that was ancient Israel, the testimony of a woman was not very highly regarded. Their testimony was worth only a fraction of that of a male witness. So Josephus, for example, says, but let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. The Talmud says, any evidence a woman gives is not valid to honor. He writes in the appendix to Antony Flou's book, There Was a God, he says, and I quote, as historians, we are obliged to comment that if these stories had been made up 5 years later, let alone 30, 40, or 50 years later, they would never have had Mary Magdalene in this role. To put Mary there is, from the point of view of Christian apologists, wanting to explain to a skeptical audience that Jesus really did rise from the dead, like shooting themselves in the foot. But to us as historians, this kind of thing is gold dust. The early Christians would never have made this up. Now, of course, this argument has not gone without objection. So Bart Ehrman, well-known New Testament critical scholar, he, in his book, How Jesus Became God, says, I used to hold this view as well. And so I see its force. But now that I have gone more deeply into the matter, I see its real flaw. It suffers, in short, from a poverty of imagination. It does not take much mental effort to imagine who would come up with a story in which the female followers of Jesus, rather than the male followers, discovered the tomb. But who would invent women as witnesses in the empty tomb? Well, for openers, maybe women would. It does not take a great deal of imagination to think that female storytellers indicated that women were the first to believe in the resurrection after finding Jesus' tomb empty. Moreover, the claim that women found the empty tomb makes the best sense of the realities of history. Preparing bodies for burial was commonly the work of women, not men. And so why wouldn't the stories tell of women who went to prepare the body? Moreover, if in the stories they are the ones who went to the tomb to anoint the body, naturally they would be the ones who found the tomb empty. But I don't find that objection to be particularly compelling, because there could be other motivations that are attributed to the women as to why they go to the tomb on Easter, other motivations are attributed to the witnesses of the empty tomb, other than going to anoint the body. And so it doesn't seem to me to be particularly probable on the hypothesis of fiction that they would attribute the discovery of the empty tomb to women, given that that is counterproductive to the apologetic purpose. So if you're making up the stories, you would be more likely, I think, to make male witnesses the chief discoverers. It's not an ironclad argument. I've never argued that, but I think it is more surprising on the fictionalist hypothesis than it is on the historicist hypothesis when it comes to the discovery of the empty tomb. Furthermore, you can bolster the argument or make it stronger or more rigorous by noting that the Gospels, when it comes to the discovery of the empty tomb by women, are actually independent of one another. And there's a couple lines of evidence to support this. For example, when you look at the identity of the women that discovered the empty tomb, the synoptics, the identity varies a little bit. In Mark, it's Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome. In Matthew, it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Luke 24 says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and then he's very explicit. He's not giving us an exhaustive list. The other woman with them who told these things to the apostles. So the identity variation there in the Synoptic Gospel is not particularly problematic, but it does, I think, point to the independence of the story. John 20 verse 1 is interesting because it says on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw the stone being taken away from the tomb. And so one might wonder whether John is suggesting Mary was the only one who came. We can actually push the argument further, the objection further, because in Matthew 28, Mary Magdalene is listed as being present with the woman that discovered the empty tomb, and they have an encounter with the risen Jesus there in Matthew 28. And so how is it then that she doesn't know what's happened to the body of Jesus when she comes back to Peter and the beloved disciple? But you'd predict on the historicist hypothesis that Mary Magdalene, if these accounts really are harmonizable, Mary Magdalene must have left the group of women prior to their encounter with the risen Jesus. And this is precisely what is suggested by a close reading of John 20 verse 2, that she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know," the Greek verb is in the plural, oudamen, "where they have laid him." And so Mary's choice of words reveals in passing that there were other women, and John's report of these words shows that he knows this. And so you've got this undesigned or artless dovetailing between John and the Synoptic Gospels at this point, in fact, pointing to, I would argue, the independence of the accounts. We have also more evidence concerning the women, though. So in Luke 8, we have a list of various women that followed Jesus out of Galilee. It says, "Soon afterwards, he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming, bringing the good news of the kingdom of God, and the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means." So we can infer from the previous chapter in Luke 7 that Jesus and his disciples are in Galilee. Capernaum is on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, and it's also supported that the women are from Galilee because Joanna was the wife of Herod's household manager, and Herod, of course, was the tetrarch of Galilee. Now, in Mark 14, it notes that when Jesus is being crucified, there were also some women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So you'll notice that those names overlap only partially with what we have in Luke 8. In Mark and Matthew, the names that are given are Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome, and there's no mention here of Joanna or Susanna. In Luke 8, also doesn't mention Mary the mother of James or Salome. And so it doesn't look like Luke added the passage in chapter 8 in order to place the women earlier in Jesus' ministry and thus integrate his narrative with Matthew and Mark concerning the women at the cross, because the names only partially overlap. And Luke would have presumably included Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, and perhaps left out Susanna if he was fictionalizing the verses in chapter 8 on the basis of Mark's mention of the woman at the cross. And Luke himself mentions the woman who came from Galilee at the cross and burial in Luke 23, verse 49 and 55, but he doesn't even name any of them there. And so both accounts, therefore, confirm apparently independently that there was in fact a group of women who'd begun following Jesus in Galilee and who continues to do so, and who helped Jesus in concrete ways by ministering or providing. But wait, there's more. So in Luke 24, 6 through 10, the women discover the tomb empty. And they're told by the angels, he is not here, but is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. And they, that's the women who'd followed him from Galilee, remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. And so we see here that these women really were personally with Jesus in Galilee. They heard what he said there. And when Luke names various women who brought the disciples news of the empty tomb and the message of the angel in Luke 24:10, he names Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Joanna, and says that there were other women as well. So he's not giving an exhaustive list. Now, he doesn't seem to be trying to reproduce his own list from chapter 8, because Mary, the mother of James, was not in that list, and Susanna isn't mentioned in 24:10. And he's also not reproducing Mark's list of women at the cross, or Mark's list of women who came to the tomb, Mark 16:1, because Salome isn't included in Luke's list, and Joanna, who's only found in Luke, is not included in Mark's list. And so Luke appears to be listing out women that he really knows were present for the events on Easter morning. And he apparently just isn't sure about Susanna's presence, or for whatever reason just doesn't mention her. And he knows that Mary, the mother of James, was there on Easter morning, even though she isn't listed in his chapter 8. And so this is an example of an undesigned coincidence that's internal to Luke, where you have fairly distant parts of Luke's own narrative fitting together in a very casual, artless, undeliberate way. And so that also supports the role of women as the chief discoverers of the tomb. You might also wonder, why involve the women at all? This is somewhat independent of the criterion of embarrassment that I alluded to previously. Why involve the women at all in the first place? This is a matter of getting these 5, at least, women unnecessarily involved and inducing them to say that they were the first to see Jesus risen, and they saw angels, and then counting on them to keep up their side of the story. Why involve them in that social context? It's not as though their stories were especially likely to carry conviction, and their stories weren't necessary even for such a conspiracy. And adding them to the story involves additional risk of discovery, both due to the additional numbers of conspirators and due to other social influences on the women. So they're going to be subject to outside influences such as male figures in their lives, husbands, fathers, etc. And so involving them in the conspiracy seems rather peculiar if they're fictionalizing the story. In terms of these outside influences, Joanna was the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Chuza was no influence upon Mary Magdalene, though, and so they're subject to different outside influences. And so that seems like a very peculiar move if the story is just being fictionalized deliberately. Also consider the number and variety of people that would have to be involved in such a conspiracy. If the claim of Jesus' resurrection is a conspiracy, the number of people involved included the 11, the Apostle Paul, at least 5 or 6 women, Cleopas and his companion, James, the brother of Jesus, Matthias and Barsabbas, called Justus, who are both named in Acts 1:23 as fulfilling the requirements of an apostle, that is, having been witnesses to the resurrection. So being conservative and including only those individuals who are specifically named, there would have needed to be at least 23 individuals involved in the conspiracy. And it seems quite implausible that all of those individuals had something to gain by asserting that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and that none of them would have recanted or changed their mind for whatever reason. And Paul mentions 500 at once, and even if one thinks that Paul might have been mistaken in naming such a large number, it seems like there was some good-sized group besides the 11 who claimed to have seen Jesus for themselves, which probably took place in Galilee. I think that it's quite plausible that the account in Matthew 28 of the group appearance on the mountain may well be the appearance of the 500, though not committal on that particular point. Let's also consider the different groups of Jesus' followers. So Jesus' own followers seem to have existed in concentric circles. Lydia McGrew makes this point, which I think is a very good one. So you've got the closest 3, Peter, James, and John. They're kind of Jesus' innermost circle. And then you've got the 12, you've got the 72 that are mentioned in Luke 10, and you've got some still larger group. And so the alleged witnesses are not all equally tight-knit and not all equally under the influence of some charismatic leader, and their interests are not all the same. And in terms of that's some still larger groups, so Luke 24:33 mentions that they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, which implies that there was a larger group besides just the 11. So we appear to have some in all of these groups who said that they actually saw Jesus risen, and at least one, namely James, who was in Jesus' own lifetime outside of all of these groups. And so it's highly unlikely that such a large heterogeneous group conspiracy would not have it is highly likely that such a large heterogeneous group conspiracy would not have held together over time, especially as persecution increased with the beating of Peter and John, which we read of in Acts, and then the stoning of Stephen, and the persecution from Saul of Tarsus, etc. So in conclusion then, we've shown that we possess testimony from apostolic eyewitnesses that Jesus rose physically from the dead and appeared to them alive, that the content of the apostolic testimony makes it quite unlikely that they were deceived. It's a sort of set of testimonial claims about which it's quite difficult to be honestly mistaken. We've seen that the circumstances of the apostolic testimony makes it quite unlikely that they were deceivers, because they were willing to undergo and endure dangers and sufferings and hardships and imprisonments and persecutions against their own self-interest, in some cases martyrdom. And so, therefore, if they weren't lying, they were honestly mistaken, I would argue that the most probable or best explanation of the pertinent facts is that the content of their testimony is true. And so I conclude with with the explanation the angels themselves gave the women at the tomb in Mark 16:6. Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. And so again, we've only touched the pinnacle of the iceberg this evening. If you want further reading, I recommend William Paley's book, A View of the Evidence of Christianity, as well as John Kennedy's work, The Resurrection of Jesus Christ and Historical Fact. And of course, all the books and resources I've recommended in previous sessions concerning the grounding of the Gospels and Acts and eyewitness testimony are relevant to this case as well. So I recommend all of those to your reading. But thanks for your attention. Happy to entertain any questions.